It'll be a retirement thing. When I retire, I'll catch up my pictures. The last 25 years. I don't know. I'm trying to think that slowing down has implications. Some of them are good and some of them are not. But I guess it has to happen. Another 20 years. That'll be almost 50, probably. Another 20 years.
Yes.
The more you travel, the faster you go. You gain time. Or you age faster.
Most of my
I want to start on that video.
Yeah.
Oh,
I don't know, yeah, carried all birds.
I just had a couple, but I do have one. I'll just have it. I'll put that in, so that all goes at the same time.
Yeah, navigate that when we get there.
Yeah. Does lighting work? Do we have to have the lights on? Yes.
No.
Okay, because I think in some ways it works a bit better to have it. Here, like one of the pictures. So it's. Oh my gosh. You need a bigger screen. Like I kind of feel like you can put a screen that's like another. Like TVs is getting so big. We should have like a 25-foot screen.
Compared to a lot of the other.
Yeah.
Right, I got 1205.
Whenever you want to go.
All right, welcome everybody to this week's Earth Sciences Lunch and Learn seminar series. We don't have another seminar until November 15th. And then we're going to do a series of seminars on student summer internships and research experiences from this past summer. Today's speaker, Ben Edwards. Here he is. Got his bachelor's degree at Carleton in 1989, his master's at University of Wyoming in 1993, has PhD at University of British Columbia in 1997 and came to Dickinson in 2002. He worked his way through the academic ranks as assistant associate and full professor, and most recently, he's now the Moraine Chair in Arctic Studies. And Ben will be giving us a beautiful slideshow on travels to ice 2021 to 2022. Welcome, Ben.
Okay, so this is gonna just be mostly pretty pictures. There's a few maps. We don't just take pretty pictures or attempt to when we travel. A lot of these trips are educational, but we had kind of a slowdown for a year or two, and then we've all realized that we just have to learn to adjust to current conditions and continue with life. So this is a hopefully a demonstration of that. This is a brief summary of 5 different trips that I've taken in about the last 14 months. All of them with Dickinson students and or alums. Several of them, there's a bunch of repeats. You'll see the word Iceland and Iceland maps and lots of Iceland pictures because I've been there 3 times. And just to throw in for good measure, we've also been to the high Arctic on a pretty amazing but very whirlwind trip. We traveled almost 10,000 kilometers in the space of 5 or 6 days, 7 days. It's fun to travel. I barely looked at any of the photos I'd taken on that trip because we came back and had so many other things to run around and do. I'm going to do this. And then I also just briefly will mention another ice trip to the south. So most of these trips are going from Dickinson north, but there's one trip that's actually went from Dickinson to the south. I'll be going there again with some students, hopefully in January. In the future, I'll to the same place as well. And what I decided to do was go in reverse order. So I'm gonna go from the most recent to the last, and you'll see in the end sort of why I say the trip from August 2021 till the end. Because some of the things we saw there, everything is very spectacular that we see, but there we saw some few special things that are kind of hard to compete with. So I didn't want to start off there. We're gonna, and that doesn't reflect anything about the trips. Trips are all spectacular. In some ways, this most recent trip, the Axel Heiberg, was one of the more remote trips. Well, it was by far the most remote trip of any of these. We were in a place where there were probably 50 people within 300 or 400 kilometers of us. So very, very remote. Okay. And I'm gonna let, there's a few fellow travelers in the room. And when I'm done with trips, if the fellow travelers want to say anything, certainly they don't have to, but if they want to, they can pop up and throw stuff in and add stuff to the trip. Or while I'm going along, you guys just shout out if there's anything I missed when I'm pointing at the picture. The first trip was the longest. This is a trip we've done a couple of times. We've done this, we actually did this trip with John and Susan Pohl, who are Dickinson alums, who have sponsored a lot of our Arctic travel. And a lot of times we go on trips and do research into the things and they don't come with us, but we have a few special trips where they actually come with us. So John and Susan came with us on this trip, and we've done a number of trips to the high Arctic. This is the furthest north we've done for Dickinson trip. We got exactly to 80 degrees north by running to the end of the runway and running off into the tundra, putting GPS held high, get to 80 degrees north. Second time I'd been to that spot. First time I didn't realize how close we were. Then I checked and realized if I ever got back, I had to run quickly while they're refueling the plane. All of these trips involve a lot of travel. Travel's gotten easier. I think for this last trip, we didn't have to do really anything COVID related. When we did this trip, I think that's right. Did we have to? I don't think we had to show anyone, stamps or get vaccines or anything. Of course, we all were, and we were all careful. But for this, you'll see that change as we go back in time over the last year. But for this trip, we went to a really remote part of Canada, in a place that is relatively new as far as some changes go in Canada. We flew to Iqaluit, which is the capital of the territory of Nunavut. And Nunavut is an indigenous territory in Canada that only got recognized and given sort of rights for government in the 1990s. And Nunavut covers a little bit of the Ungava Peninsula, but basically it's mainly from Baffin Island up to the tip of Ellesmere Island. And that's the furthest north of Canada. It starts in the low Arctic at Iqaluit and goes to the high Arctic on Ellesmere Island, which we've gone to a couple times, and Axel Heiberg. This is the first time we'd ever gone to Axel Heiberg. Amazing place, very, very remote. You do 4,400 kilometers plus of travel in about 24 hours. So lots of planes. You cover lots and lots of ground, you see lots and lots of things. You start off at Dickinson. We met up in New Jersey. We flew from New York to Ottawa, spent one night, got up the next morning very early. We go Ottawa, Iqaluit, Pond Inlet to, oh, no, sorry. We went Iqaluit to Hall Beach, Pond Inlet. Can you stop in Arctic Bay going up? Arctic Bay, which is over in here, and then Arctic Bay to Resolute. And Resolute on Cornwallis Island is sort of the main expedition base for all of the high Arctic. So many researchers that go there, including other Dickinson researchers, go to Resolute Bay, you stay there, and it's very different geology, we'll see in a minute. And then from Resolute, which is basically commercial flights all the way up to here, from Resolute, then you get on a private charter plane and fly up to Axel Heiberg. There's no one that lives on Axel Heiberg. There's only one very small community here. There's a little community here, and there are no permanent settlements in any of the rest of those islands. So very, very remote part of the Arctic. Why did we go? Well, number of reasons. We wanted mainly to see the geology here. This is Axel Heiberg. This is a geologic map. And the Arctic that we saw changes a lot. So there are parts of the Arctic that are very flat, for lack of better words. They have tundra. It's very isolated. But there also are parts of the high Canadian Arctic that have big mountains. And we saw both. We landed on Cornwallis Island right here. It's very flat. You fly over Cornwallis, over part of Devon, and then you come across. You're flying mainly over sea ice until we get to Axel Heiberg. And one of the trips, we actually came and landed on Ellesmere briefly to get fuel, and then we came back and went back to Resolute. But there are so there's a range of topography and geology that really controls the landscape, because the geology controls whether you have mountains or whether you have relatively flat areas, and then that controls the vegetation, and then that controls the animals and the wildlife and what people do there. So there these black lines, these colors are different geological settings. And these black lines represent places where there essentially has been mountain building. So we flew from the flats up to Axel Heiberg, which has pretty spectacular mountains. And we were going for a number of reasons to this spot. We were going because John and Susan really wanted to go here. We wanted to see muskox, which we saw, but only in the distance. We wanted to also look for fossils. So one of the things about the Canadian Arctic that's quite striking, just a blink ago as far as geologic time goes, and while these islands were still tectonically in about the same place, we go back 5 to 20 to 30 to 40 million years, there were forests here. And we know that because the fossil trees are still there. And some of these fossil forests, because of the setting and the way the fossil trees were buried, some of the fossil wood that can be a few tens of millions of years old, you can still burn because it hasn't turned into rock. We found some samples actually just in a riverbed that have been eroded from somewhere. We're not sure if they're a few million years old or if they are 50 million years old, which is the old age of some of the older fossil forests here. So this is a unique setting. All of these colors are different rock types, mostly different sedimentary rocks, but there are some interesting igneous rocks here as well. There's also an interesting deposit of a mineral called gypsum. And we'll see pictures of that in just a minute, because there actually are springs here. You might say, okay, fine, you're in the mountains. That shouldn't seem surprising, but this area is all permafrost. And that means it's not sort of normal ground where you expect to have springs coming from underground to the surface, because there's a layer of frozen ground, permanently frozen ground between the surface and maybe 100, 200 meters depth when you get to places deeper in the earth where the temperature can warm back up. So very unique to have these springs here. Lots of science has been done here. There are 2 different camps that we briefly saw. McGill University has a high Arctic research station there. And we actually ran into a Dickinson alum at the High Arctic Research Station who just happened to be there at the same time we were there. So we have a number of Dickinson alums who have gone on Arctic trips and then continued on to graduate school to do Arctic research on their own. This was Heba Aoud, who graduated a few years ago, and she's actually doing master's research now looking at some of the biogenic minerals that are found up in these mountains. So she was camped there to go get samples. And I fortunately got a chance to go up there very briefly and meet her. So that was kind of fun to see an alum at almost 80 degrees north. We stayed down here, actually. There's a base camp here. There's a few buildings, so probably 50 or 60 people camped in this area. This is mainly where researchers go. We ended up camping down here, so we had a little bit more space to ourselves. This is an old Canadian Space Agency building. You'll see a picture of it in just a second from a distance. And then we basically did day hikes in this area. We did a little bit of work looking at permafrost and frost boils in here as maybe a seed project for going back and doing more work there at some point in the future. And so we saw a couple big glaciers. Of course, you see a lot of glaciers there, but we kind of had our own little smaller Crusoe glacier, which we got to go up and inspect as well. So this is what it looks like from a satellite image. You notice there's not a lot of vegetation, not a lot of different colors. A lot of the colors you see in these pictures are colors due to differences in rocks. But this is a pretty, well, area that's typical of the high Arctic. Low vegetation, not a lot of vegetation, a lot of big rivers that are braided rivers, alluvial fans, and then also ice. So when you leave Cornwallis Island, it looks like this. And the plane you get, most of the pictures aren't too bad, but obviously, you know, these planes do heavy work. These planes that we flew in are called Twin Otters. They're the workhorse of both the North and South Pole. The pilots that we had here and the planes we flew in this summer, several of those are now migrating down to the Antarctic. And they do that every year because these planes are some of the best planes for working in very difficult conditions. And it's the only way to get from Resolute basically anywhere to the high Arctic. Cornwallis, out of the mountain belts, very, very flat, very gentle topography. You can see great distances, and there's not a lot that you see. We saw a few specks that might have been muskox, but there actually is not much wildlife in the Arctic. And it tends to be quite spread out because the conditions are very harsh and there's not a lot of food. This is still Cornwallis. All of this area, while it doesn't have a lot of wildlife, it has a lot of geologically interesting things. So almost everything you're seeing here, well, certainly everything you're seeing here is permafrost, but you can see there's actually also several different ways that the permafrost forms and shapes the sediments at the surface to make something called patterned ground. So this isn't your eyes playing tricks on you. These are actually frost boils and frost polygons that are forming by freeze-thaw action of permafrost. We also have stone stripes. The stripe patterns are also patterns produced by permafrost. So the geological system here, where you have sediments and you have ground that freezes and thaws, it actually changes the sediments, makes patterns. And we actually have patterned ground that looks something like this in Carlisle, or very close. And so this is an interesting phenomenon to think about, how soils and ground can create a record that changes over time. Even with global warming, if you move trees up here and you got vegetation here, this patterned ground will still remain as an indication that this area was at some point permafrost. And what patterned ground tells us in Carlisle is probably that Carlisle, 20,000 years ago, had permafrost. 20,000 years ago, northern Pennsylvania, an hour and a half, 2 hours away, would have had the edge of the Laurentide ice sheet, which is 3 kilometer thick glacier. You could have driven to northern Pennsylvania, got out ice axes, climbed up onto the ice, and you could have skied to Alaska. You could have skied almost to Greenland without touching the ground. Probably the biggest ice sheet maybe in the history of Earth. And it formed many times. And it covered this area. Once you get to Axel Heiberg, you change from the relatively flat, tectonically not active, certainly not recently active, low Arctic, wrong direction, to this. So these are the mountain belts in the high Arctic, where you've had tectonic activity in the last 30 to 50 million years. There's a couple different orogenic events that have shaped these mountains. And so this is flying into Axel Heiberg to our base camp. And there's our base camp. We had a reception party waiting for us. This area is always cold. A warm day might be 50 degrees. It's always sort of wet. We were very glad to have the shelter because it was nice to have a place out of the wind to get together. But we were much better off than this group, because this group was a group of hikers that had been hiking for 10 days, living in tents. And up to the time we got there, there'd been rain almost every day. So they were very glad to see us because they were getting out. So we landed the plane and they quickly got on the plane and left to go back to civilization. But they had already set up a couple tents for us because we basically, their group leaders were the same group leaders that we had, one of them at least, that we had for our trip as well. So this trip was run through a professional guide service because when you go in this part of the world, you need professionals. There could be polar bears, although not likely here. You're in very steep terrain. People could get sick. And so we've done many trips with a company called Black Feather. And this is one of our guides that she guided Marcus on his first trip here in 2013. So she's been working with us for over a decade. And this was kind of a special place because one of the reasons we were very happy to have Candace with us is because she actually did her master's degree research on that glacier. So for her, it was quite fun to come back to Axel Heiberg and to walk around with us and talk about this area that she studied during her graduate program. These are both our guides, and this is up at Crusoe Glacier, which was the closest glacier that we could get to. We spent, every clear day, we could look up and see this glacier on the mountain, the very tip of it. Well, it's good to watch from a distance. This is still a very active glacier. We couldn't actually get to the edges here because this ice periodically falls off. And so you have to be very careful when you're around a glacier like this that you don't get spalled on by ice. But we can see it in the distance. So we do lots of things on these trips that are burst. I've crossed lots and lots of streams, many, many places. This is the first time I'd ever carried a bridge with me. And our Canadian Space Agency camp, fortunately, there'd been a couple buildings there. There was only one remaining, but it meant that all the wood from the buildings was there. So we knew we had to cross a few streams on one of our hikes. So we just took some 2x4s with us. And this water's not very deep, but you don't want to get wet feet in these kinds of conditions if you can help it. So even just walking across in a board, and then we just laid the boards on the side of the creek, and then we came back, we could just take our bridge home with us. One of the big hikes we took was to get to this unique spring. So when you look at this stream, it doesn't really look all that amazing, just like a stream in gray rocks. But when you get down and start looking at the things that are forming on the rocks here, and this picture didn't turn out very well, but this stream is precipitating the mineral gypsum, which is a calcium sulfate, which is a relatively unusual mineral to form at this temperature and these conditions. And even more unusual because the spring is coming from a mountain that comes out of permafrost. And permafrost is permanently frozen ground. So how do you get a spring coming up through permanently frozen ground? And there's lots of work that's been done on this, in part because we do think there's evidence periodically for water on the surface of Mars. And Mars is also a very cold planet, just like the Arctic is. And so one of the reasons people come to study this is to try to figure out, could this sort of deposit also be forming on planets like Mars? And then we do learn some techniques. This is kind of a proto study that we did. Looking at what you can't see is we're actually in the middle of a frost polygon that's probably 100 meters on a side. And we're actually inside this big polygon. And inside the big polygon, there are a bunch of little frost boils. So with Olive and Casey, and this is Susan taking notes for us. She likes to go in the field with us and do stuff. We decided that we do some initial characterization of these frost boils in case we get a chance to go back and do more studies here. So each one of these little mounds is a frost boil. So we were measuring the depth of the mound, we were measuring the diameter of the frost boil. We were also doing a kind of a basic characterization of how many plant species were in this. So we could take that data and then potentially use that data to go back and say, what we'd like to do now is a much broader, more systematic study. We did this in 4 or 5 places, something like that. And go back maybe with a drone, fly low level, and take pictures so we could actually make thousands of measurements of these. And then we can start to look at things like, how does soil type affect the size of the frost boils? Because there are lots of different rocks in this area, and so there are different soils that would form on those rocks. Also, how does plant life? Is there a correlation between plant life and the types of plant species and the size of the frost boils or their topographic position? So we collected a little bit of data, not enough that we would publish anything from this, but it gives us kind of a head start if we decide to go back and do a more extensive research project. And then we saw lots of other things. These are Arctic poppies. Is that right? I think that's right. Yeah. This is Arctic foxy. We saw, you see limited bird life, but you do see some birds. This is a loon on, just by the little hotel we stayed at Resolute. And then this is King of Resolute Bay. Okay, so that's kind of the first trip. We only have 4 more to go. Some of them don't. This is probably the most extensive with pictures, because this is sort of the thing that's the most different. And Iceland, you'll see we have lots of pictures of Iceland, even though they're 3 different trips. So any questions about this first part or anything anyone wants to add?
I'll just say, like, as someone who went on the trip, it was definitely not something that I ever thought I would be able to do when I first got to Dickinson, and I had never done anything like that. But it was an incredible experience, and if you're interested, even in the least bit, I recommend talking to your professors about it.
Yeah. So we do trips almost every summer. We don't, some of the trips, this trip we only had 2 students on because it was a long ways to go. It's a big journey to go on a trip like this. We do other trips. You'll see in Iceland, we have more students. We probably, as just a note, keep your eyes open for and ears open. We're thinking about a trip to Svalbard, which is also in the high Arctic, but on the other side of Greenland for this coming summer. So that's a possibility. Okay. So going back slightly more in time, that was midsummer. At the end of school last year, we did a trip associated with the Arctic Studies course. Every spring, we have an introduction to Arctic Studies course every spring, and we don't always do trips associated with that. But this year, this past year, we actually did 2 trips that were basically focused around that class. So instead of going along the west side of Greenland and the high Canadian Arctic, now we went across Greenland and to Iceland. And Iceland's a place I've been to, I think, 15 or 20 times in my life. This is an Icelandic sweater, not knit by an Icelander, knit by my wife, but my wife was taught how to knit this pattern by an Icelander, who's my friend, and this is Icelandic wool that we got in Iceland. I like to rep Iceland a lot because I've been there a lot and have lots of friends there, and it's an amazing place. These trips are all different. So thinking about what we've gone through the last couple of years with adjustments, the high Arctic trip, we didn't have to do anything as far as COVID goes, even though we were going to a really remote place that had basically been closed during COVID because they really didn't want COVID to come up into those high communities. Small numbers of people, not a lot of medical facilities. But by last summer, all those restrictions are off. When we went to Iceland in May, right? So there's no one here that went on the May trip, right? You went on. No, you did go. Yeah. Okay, I'm getting confused, right? Yeah. So I'm trying to remember. Do we have to get shots before we went? Or do we have to have our COVID cards? I
don't think so, but like when I got COVID there were a lot of protocols, like not protocols, like official ones, but like to get back to the US because that was still I think they lifted that maybe like a week or 2 after we left.
Right.
It was just like getting the fit to fly and whatnot, but I think that's all gone. So anybody looking to do that again won't have to worry about that.
Yeah, so we had all kinds of different experiences with COVID rules. You'll see as we go back in time. But today, for most of these trips, there's, we would want you to get vaccinated to be safe, but there's really not the same sort of protocols like you'll hear. I'll mention briefly when we went to Chile. It's probably the most extreme for what we had to do there. And that's just this past January. So, and I have to say thanks to Barb Faulkner. Barb Faulkner is right here. She's an alum from the 1970s, a geologist, worked as a professional geologist for many years. She's retired now. And she actually came on this trip with us in the spring. And she's been a big supporter of our Arctic program as well. And she has a lot of passion for the Arctic. She's worked in Russia. She's worked in Alaska. And so it was great to have another geologist on the trip. Here we are standing where? Why is this important? Remember?
Was that where the 2 tectonic plates met?
That's exactly where this is. So one of the things about Iceland that's really important geologically and interesting from a geological perspective, Iceland is right at the edge of a plate boundary. And not quite, but almost literally, I'm on the North American plate and Jonathan is on the Eurasian plate. Not quite that dramatic, but close. Iceland's a place where the tectonic plates split apart. And if you're in Eastern Iceland, you're part of the Eurasian plate. If you're in Western Iceland, you're part of the North American plate. And so it's got amazing geology. And here we're actually in one of the grabens, one of the fault areas at the very southwestern tip of the Reykjanes Peninsula, where you can actually see this. You can actually walk across these little valleys. So we did lots of different things on these sorts of trips. We're kind of experiencing Iceland, the geology, the people, the animals. Lots of Iceland's got its unique style of pony. The early Icelanders came to Iceland. They were a variety of different peoples from Scandinavia. They came in about 950 AD. So Icelanders have been living in Iceland for 1,000 years or more. And the first ponies they brought with them, because it was a relatively isolated place, there wasn't a lot of mixture of other horse types. And over time, they've actually evolved a separate breed of horse called the Icelandic pony. They don't like it called a pony. It's technically pony size, but it's a very unique animal and unique to Iceland. If they leave Iceland, they can never come back. So like you can't take these for horse shows and other things off the island unless you intend to never bring them back. They're very protective of their agriculture and their animals because it's such a small, isolated place. So if you see an Icelandic horse that's outside of Iceland, it'll never be able to go back. One of the other things, of course, we wanted to see is this lava. This is lava from at this point, this lava was 9 months old, something like that. And this is the lava, the surface of the lava flow. We'll see more pictures of that in a little bit. So one of the reasons we go to Iceland is not only is it where two plates separate, but it means it's geologically very active. There are glaciers, there are volcanoes, there's all kinds of things to see, including young rocks. So this rock, I guess it's about a year old now, so it's aging quickly, but it's quite a bit younger than anyone in the room. And we also get to interact with a lot of great people. This is Oli. Oli runs a program called GeoCamp, and we've been doing the last couple of trips with GeoCamp. And it's always good to have contact with local people when you can. And Oli sort of goes to an extreme. On the trip we took in August, he was our bus driver and our guide. On this trip, he was busy, so he couldn't be with us the whole time. But he took us out to the Reykjanes Peninsula for a day tour. We saw lots and lots of amazing sea cliffs and rocks. His grandfather, it doesn't exist here anymore, but there actually used to be a lighthouse out here. And his grandfather was the first person to live in that lighthouse. And you can maybe get a sense as to why the lighthouse is no longer there, because these cliffs are actively eroding. And they're actually actively eroding back. So they're increasingly not allowing people to go up there as much, although you still can walk up this trail and you can walk all the way around this. This is an old volcano that erupted probably at the edge of the ocean. And so many of these rocks erupted underwater. And that also makes them relatively unstable. Also a great place for seabirds. Do I have? Wow, maybe I don't. I have to look and see. I don't know if I put any seabird pictures in here. But one of the reasons why Iceland is attracted to seabirds, lots of shallow water, so lots of fish, so lots of things for them to eat, but also lots of pretty inaccessible cliffs. So there are places that they can nest safely. Also, not many predators. The Arctic fox is the only mammal that's native to Iceland. And the Arctic fox will try to eat birds, but there aren't many other predators. Besides, there are some birds that are predatory on each other. But lots and lots of seabirds, lots of geothermal activity. So this is a geothermal spring out on that southwestern part of the Reykjanes Peninsula. This is some of the evidence that we know that this area is still very geologically active, because if you drill down very far, you hit hot water and then you hit steam. One of the keys to Iceland as a society is that Iceland has lots and lots of geothermal energy. So they can do lots of sort of green energy production to the point where we actually ship, and I say we, I mean the world, we ship aluminum ore to Iceland to be smelted, because Iceland has so much excess and green electricity from its hydrothermal and hydroelectric projects that you can afford to do processes there that require a lot of energy. Lots and lots of waterfalls. We'll see this wall in a little bit in March to see what it looks like in the winter. But this is what it looks like in the summer. Lots of viewing platforms. Iceland has really undergone a transformation from the tourism perspective. Before 2010, there may be a few 100,000 tourists there a year. Now it's several million. And that's really put a strain on the infrastructure for places like this. And so Iceland's trying very rapidly to upgrade the infrastructure. It used to be there were just dirt trails there. It was just, you know, a bunch of Icelanders that went up and walked around and took pictures, and they didn't need a platform and they didn't need, you know, handrails and things like that. But with millions of tourists now, they really had to transform a lot of the iconic sites in subtle, relatively subtle ways. You know, things like bathrooms. They didn't have public restrooms because they didn't need it. And of course, now when you bring busloads of people and you need stuff like that in a place like this, because you want people to just wander off into the bushes. Has anyone ever heard of a geyser before? Yeah. Geyser is the proper pronunciation because it's actually an Icelandic word. And this is Stroker, so this isn't geyser, but they're just next door to this is the remnants of geyser, which is the geyser from which we get the name. It's not active anymore, but Stroker geyser erupts every 15, 20 minutes, something like that. And so if you wait long enough, you'll get to see it erupt. We also increasingly in Iceland are developing friendships where we get to interact with people. So this is Bjorn, Oli's son. They have an amazing summer house that they invite us to go to dinner. Usually they make this. We actually did pizza, my favorite pizza place, I think, this night. We were there in last August. They actually made us an amazing home cooked meal. So it's a great chance to actually talk to people who live in Iceland, who work in Iceland, and who also have very nice vacation houses with beautiful views. So Iceland and Icelanders have been living with nature for a long time. And so volcanic eruptions, earthquakes, just in the last couple of days, they've had a couple of severe weather storms where they had big blizzards that come through. And so they're used to living with disaster. And one of the big disasters that we have a little connection to is the disaster that buried this house. 1973, in February, in the middle of the night, so that's winter in Iceland, right? And you can imagine it's kind of cold, and this is an island in the ocean. Someone looks out the window and it looks like there's a forest fire. Like, wow, that's weird. And they went outside, and lo and behold, it was a volcano. A fissure opened up in the island. The island is a volcano, so that's not too surprising. In the middle of the night in February, and started spewing lava into the air. There were, I think, about 5,000 people on the island at the time. And fortunately for the people of the island, the weather had been bad because the people that live here fish. Because the weather was bad, that meant that fishing boats were all in the harbor. So in the middle of the night, in the middle of the winter, in February, they loaded 5,000 people on boats and took them for 3.5 hours to the nearest ferry to get them off the island. Pretty amazing. Everyone made it. Over time, this volcanic eruption lasted several months. There's all sorts of interesting things. We can tell stories about that later, about what happened. But this is sort of another unique type thing that the Icelanders did. So this is actually a modern archaeological excavation. They've actually taken a building and built the building over a building. This building is a house that was buried by the volcanic ash during that 1973 eruption. And as the town slowly came back and they started to rebuild things, people found this particular house. You know, it's not livable. There's no way you could dig this out, really make it livable. They actually decided to turn to a museum. So this is inside a museum. So they built a museum around the house that they partially excavated from the volcanic ash. And then you go around the museum, and the museum's built around this house that they saved. And as you go around, it kind of tells you the story of the volcano and the volcanic eruption in the island. Iceland's got some amazing museums. There's actually a place now where you can go and see lava floors in Iceland, 2 different places. So if the volcano is not erupting when you're there, you pay a little bit extra money and you can go and see a as close to real lava flow that erupts every hour and a half, because that's when they make it erupt. Iceland also does unique things with wildlife. So does anyone know what kind of animal this is? There's a beluga whale, a white whale. They only live in the Arctic. I didn't get to see this actually, I should have gone in. Iceland doesn't have native beluga population, but Iceland does have lots of protected areas by the coast. And so they've actually are trying to develop a whale sanctuary. So this beluga, did you go in here?
Yeah.
Well, maybe you tell them, because you probably,
Yeah, well, I went there and I mean, there were two belugas in there. They're the biggest belugas I had ever seen in my life. And I've seen some belugas before, but these are huge. And I'm pretty sure these guys were rescued from Russia, I think, or like they were from Russia and then they went to China. And then I think their final destination was in Iceland, but they were in their temporary like enclosure as they were building the bigger one that kind of was built around the actual like water, like the ocean. So yeah, they were in their temporary enclosure, but these guys are massive. They were really cool. And they also had like, in that aquarium, they had the belugas. They were kind of like the showstopper ones, but they also had puffins and some other things, but the puffins and the belugas were like the really Arctic ones.
yeah, so they have a big building, a huge aquarium in it. They have the belugas in right now. Ultimately, in one of the bays on this island, they're building an enclosure so that they'll be able to put the belugas back into the ocean. They can never release them really because, you know, belugas live in the Arctic, belugas sometimes live in pods about 200 or 300. So they're very group oriented animals. So 2 belugas by themselves in Iceland, if you just turn them loose, it wouldn't be probably a good thing. But they'll put them in a place where they're back in their natural environment, which is kind of as close as you can come with animals like this. That have been taken out of nature. We did some boat rides. This is the ferry coming, I don't know if this is coming or going, this is probably going back, I guess, to going back to the mainland from the island. We were an island called Hamai, which is part of the Vestman Islands. The first trip I ever took with Dickens and students to Iceland, we took a ferry ride to Hamai as part of that trip. Because we were studying this volcanic eruption. This ferry ride was much, much more pleasant than the first one we went on. Because now they have a ferry terminal where the ferry ride is about 25 minutes. The first time I went, it was a 3.5-hour ferry ride. And yes, it was not as pleasant, but this was a beautiful day, beautiful ferry ride. And then we also experienced some Icelandic culture. These are the little hotel we stayed at had a, I don't know if they have these in the US, I guess they do. It's not really a balloon. It's like
It was,
a balloon trampoline
Yeah.
type thing, sort of.
yeah, and there was like a neighborhood, like right, like adjacent to it, and all these little Icelandic kids came later and we jumped with them for like a few hours and they spoke surprisingly good English, all of them, and it was pretty cool to talk to them. Like, they're really cute. They're all like under 12.
Yeah, so very friendly country and fun to be able to get to meet random people. For the most part, they're pretty friendly. This was another spot that we've gone to for many, many years. This is Gjökull Glacier. Gjökull actually means glacier, Jökull means glacier. And this is a Gjökull Glacial Lagoon. In 2010, this lagoon was covered by volcanic mud flows because up into here is Eyjafjallajökull, which is the volcano that erupted in 2010 that shut down air traffic in Europe and caused lots of problems. I got that opportunity to actually go and work on this eruption. So I had 3 different Dickinson students who went with me. We flew up in a helicopter basically into here. And the place that there's ice now, there was no ice in 2010. There's kind of a pretty amazing story of glacier recovery for this particular glacier. Even 2012, there was none of this ice was here. The eruption produced a lava flow that melted a channel all the way through the ice down to about here. And after the eruption, the rest of the glacier really died back. And so in the last 5 years, all of this new ice has come down. And we've been involved with some studies trying to figure out the timing of that ice coming back. Before 2010, this was a lake. It was a very iconic lake that people used to come to because it's surrounded by what's called a moraine, and the moraine comes all the way around and actually was damming the lake. In 2010, the eruption happened up here on top of the volcano. It's covered by a glacier. A lot of ice melted. The meltwaters came down here, flooded this area, broke through the dam to the lagoon, and emptied out the lagoon. And so we've been going in here for years to do a number of types of studies. In particular, one of the things we do here is we fly drones. so we can go up and get really low level aerial photography. There are new lakes that are forming here that we're trying to study. We can get pictures of the glacier to see how the glacier is changing. And it's a good place where there's no buildings, not many people, to do a little practice flying. So students get to fly the drones as well, and get a little bit of practice with doing aerial reconnaissance. We find hidden waterfalls. We actually had to go through a little, almost not quite a cave, but very, very tiny canyon to get to this waterfall, which was beautiful. We went to black sand beaches. This is called the Black Diamond Beach, actually, because this is close to a place where a glacier meets the river and lake, and it flows out into the ocean. And then the ocean and the waves bring the icebergs back on shore. And as they melt, they turn into little things that are just pure crystals of ice. The Black Diamond Beach. And then this was one of my favorite hikes I hadn't ever done before. We always see glaciers. We try to get into glaciers, but this is one I'd never been into before. And it was really a beautiful hike, and there were basically no other tourists here. So we had this glacier all to ourselves, about an hour and a half hike in. And then finally, Iceland is very much, not only with geothermal energy, but very much into sustainability. And so this was also a unique thing I'd never been to before. So this is a picture of a cod, and these are all the different things that they are trying to make from cod. So they make omega-3 oil, they make quality seafood, they use the liver for certain things, they smoke the fish. They make marine supplements to diets, they make cosmetics, they make medical products, they make fish leather. And the idea of this fish startup is they're trying to get to 100% utilization of the fish, of the catch, because Iceland very much is a fishing nation. And so this is a picture. This was a person who was telling us about all these. These are all products that are made from Icelandic fish. Okay. Anything else? That's Iceland Bay.
I only got to do half of it, because I was locked up in a hotel room for the other half, but it was still like the most amazing trip of my life. Like, it was incredible. So if you find yourself with that opportunity, certainly take it. I went as a freshman, so don't feel like you're limited either by that.
He's seen all of our both freshmen as well. Yeah. So we try to get people out at least once in 4 years, but some people, you're looking for opportunities to get out many times. So this trip, so we're going back in time now. So this is March of 2022, and this is an alumni trip that I ran. So no students on this trip. Well, everyone was a student, you're lifelong learners, but these were lifelong learning students. So a group of about 20, 25 alums, we were going to see the Northern Lights. This trip was supposed to happen in 2021, got postponed by COVID. So we did it last spring as well. And I'll try to go pretty fast. More Iceland. This is also, it's a place called Thingvellir. So this is also in southern Iceland. It's a place where you also have these large fractures. In this case, those large fractures built a topography that was utilized by the Icelandic people to have their seat of government. So the Althing, which is the Icelandic parliament, met here for several hundred years because they're natural alcoves, they're natural places where you can gather a bunch of people to have essentially a little political meeting every few years. Lots of just beautiful scenery. This is from a boat trip. These are all columnar joints in a lava flow that we saw by boat. On the same boat trip, we actually had literally seafood from the net. So they catch a little bit of seafood while you're doing this boat trip, bring it up. And if you want to try, they're as fresh as you can possibly get, unless you're like underwater, picking clams and eating them underwater. So a unique thing. They try to do this in a sustainable way, in a sustainable harvest. So you eat everything. Iceland, just stunning landscapes, and everything you see essentially is volcanic here. So these ridge lines, all these little line segments, those are all lava flows that are a few million years old that have formed over the course of Iceland being at the plate boundaries. This, let's see if this will go. Yeah. So we got a demonstration of Icelandic pony. This is unique. Gave the Icelandic ponies, and you need to watch and see what's in her hand.
Yeah.
So they do this demonstration at a place where you can get, they grow hothouse tomatoes. But the demonstration, she's holding a carbonated beverage in her hand as she rides the horse around the arena. And the point is that the gait of the Icelandic pony is so smooth that you can take your drink and ride around in a circle and not spill a drop. This is that same waterfall I mentioned a little bit ago. This is what it looks like in March. I'd never been there in the winter before. It's very spectacular. Let's see if these will work. Oh yeah. So 3 different ways that you experience water in Iceland. Obviously, lots of waterfalls, lots of ocean, and also precipitation. This may have all happened on the same day. Certainly this sort of ice pellets in the ocean, that was all the same day. Yeah. And then finally, we did see the northern lights, fortunately. It was cloudy most of the time. So when you go on trips like that, that's always kind of a concern because you have to be able to see the night sky, even if it's dark, be able to see the northern lights. But we did see them one night. And that was the focus of that trip. Okay. So let's jump down very quickly to Chile, going down instead of 4,000 kilometers north, probably that far south, and to the southern Lake District of Chile. And this is just a geologic map, different colors, different lava flows. I'm part of a big project that's got 4 more years where we're trying to look and see how do volcanoes get influenced by ice. So Villarrica volcano's got a small ice cap right now, but 20,000 years ago, if you looked at the same map, everything would have been white. This was covered by the Patagonia ice sheet and the volcanoes underneath it. So as the ice is melted, we're trying to figure out, as the ice melted, did it change the way the volcano erupted? And so I've been going there to do research, looking for lava flows that erupted under ice. Going back there in January, I'll probably go back there the next 2 or 3 years. Ian went with me up there. I will say this is not territory for the faint-hearted. We had some really, really long days hiking into base camp. We did day hikes. We also hiked in and camped for 4 or 5 days. Or, we had to take everything with us. And every morning you wake up and look and this is what you see. So this is Villarrica volcano. If you flew over the top and looked down, you'd see orange. It's got a permanent lava lake. So it's always in a state where in a few hours it could start having lava flows. We are very careful, but we don't camp in a place where the lava flows would get to us very quickly. But you can see very steep terrain. Like the Arctic in some ways, this is the Alpine as opposed to the Arctic. Not a ton of vegetation. Most of the vegetation is pretty low. In this case, lots of these rocks were probably covered by ice even 50 or 100 years ago, because it still has an active glacier on the surface. You see lots of different vegetation here, although some of the colors look familiar. It looks like Iceland without the Araucanian trees. And essentially, we're looking for lava flows that have these strange patterns of fractures to them that tell us this lava flow probably ran into ice. Almost there. So this is the last trip. This was August 2021. Again, trip Bjorn was our guide. He went with us the whole time. Fantastic to have him. Went to some new places. This is Kerlingarfjall. This is a geothermal area in central Iceland. Amazing, looks like Yellowstone, except maybe even better. Stunning colors, all geothermal alteration of volcanic rocks. This is more. Little bits of vegetation, but not much here. Lots of great food. This is at Bjorn and Bjorn's house. They made us this dinner. We didn't have pizza this time. This was probably better. Well, it definitely was better, but the pizza was good too. And then here we are sampling one of the Icelandic delicacies, which is rotten shark. I don't have the pictures. I think this is the before, so I don't have the expressions of what people thought afterwards. But and then finally, when we were there for this particular trip, of course, this was one of the things we wanted to see. So this is the view from downtown Reykjavik in August of 2021, and that's lava. So from downtown, you could actually see the volcano. So we had to hike out to the volcano a couple times. The first time we went, not much activity. The second time we went, it was about a 3-kilometer hike. So you can see everyone smiling because now we can see the lava. So even though we have a ways to go, we know that it's going to be worth seeing. This is what it looked like very close up. you could basically walk right down to the edge of the lava flows. I think it's just gonna go, yeah. So you can see this is just a short little video. There are people right down there, and there's a river of lava coming from the bubbling vent up top. This volcano also erupted again this past summer, very briefly. There's certainly a possibility now. They think that these kinds of eruptions may now start to become more common, very close. This is between Reykjavik and the airport. So it's very, very close. And that's 5 trips in slightly less than an hour. I don't know how many thousands of kilometers, all with Dickinson students. All of these are places that we probably will return to with students in the near future as part of the Arctic program or other things we do in the department. So if you have any questions, feel free to reach out to me or some of the people you've heard talking that have been on these trips. And with that, I think I'm done. Although if people have questions, I'm happy to.
Any questions for Ben? Or any of the other participants? You wowed us with all your photographs.
Hopefully it's that and not bored. But you see why I had to save these pictures till the end. Maybe I should put it at the beginning. It might have woken me up. I don't know. But there's always spectacular stuff we see. Events like this are sort of, we can't really time these. We don't know when these are going to happen. And this eruption happened to last for several months. So it just was so fortuitous that the trip ran during the course of the eruption. Although if this keeps happening, we'll Marcus and I will try to get people there to see an eruption. All right.
Thank you, Ben.
Enjoy the rest of your Tuesday.